Please state your full name and spell it.
Gene Lebrun, Genelebrun.
Okay, and today is December 12th, 2022. My name is Marci Burdock, and we are recording an oral history interview for the South Dakota State Historical Society. Do I have your permission to record this interview?
Yes, you do.
Thank you very much. Gene, let me just ask you some baseline questions. Would you start with where and when you were born and kind of just the bullet point trajectory of your education and career?
Okay, I was born in Langdon, North Dakota on July 4th, 1939. I'm the firecracker. I went to high school, grade school and high school, at a private school in Langdon. Went on to St. John's University College of Minnesota for my undergraduate degree. I majored in political science and history. I was active in the Young Democrats. In fact, my senior year, I was president of the Young Democrats and got to interview Hubert Humphrey when he came back to run for the U.S. Senate after he got beat by John Kennedy in the West Virginia primary for president. After law school, I worked that summer at the Social Security Administration in Sioux City, Iowa. Did not like being a bureaucrat, I guess. So my dad called me and asked me what I was going to do. I said I didn't know. So I'd like to go to law school. I had applied and got admitted both in Minnesota and North Dakota. He said, if you come home and help me harvest, I'll help you through law school. I said, you got a deal. So I went to law school at Grand Forks. Got married between my second and third year. And before I graduated, I got a job down in Rapid City, South Dakota. Never been here before, and this came down. So I started practicing law on the 1st of June, 1964. I was always interested in politics, as a political science major. And at that time, I didn't really know the politics of South Dakota that well. I knew there had not been a Democrat elected from this county for 30 years. And at that time, the county was one district. It wasn't split up like it is now. So that fall, the summer of 1970, I decided to run as a Democrat. At that time, there were 5 House members in the House from this district. So there were 5 Democrats running, and of course 5 Republicans running. There had not been a Democrat elected in this county for about 30 years at that time. At that election, 3 of the 5 of us were Democrats that got elected. The 2 Republicans were Jim Nelson and Julian Cheney from up by Wall. So my first 2 years was 1971 and 1972. The Republicans still controlled both houses by, I think, over 2/3. So there were a little more Democrats that year than there had been before, but we didn't have that big a number. Dick Kneip had been elected the same year, 1970. So Dick and I started in the legislature and the governor's office at the same time.
And you served from when to when in the
I
legislature?
served
70 to when?
1971 through 1974. Then I did not run again.
Okay. What was it? Let me talk about you before we segue into Dick Kneip. What was your platform? What were the issues that motivated you to want to run, and what do you think resonated with the voters that got you elected?
Well, I stressed the need for a 2-party system. And I'd done some research, and I found that the Republicans had done a lot of studies on the need for funding education, need of tax reform, things like that. They did the studies, but they never did anything about it. So I kind of used those 2 things as my primary platform. And at that time, we didn't put up billboards. We didn't put up even yard signs. I had some little cards made up with my name and running for the state legislature. But I bet you I didn't spend $500 to run. And that was typical.
And did those issues then, were they still the same predominant issues as you ran for re-election 2 years later?
Somewhat. Having served 2 years, I knew some new issues then, some things that came up during my first 2 years, and we kind of stressed those. And we kept talking about the need for a strong two-party system. And I think in 1972, when I ran again, the Democrats nationwide were doing pretty well.
And ultimately, was it 72 when Democratic majority occurred in both the House?
No, 73. The 72 election. But in 73, we ended up with a tie in the House, and the Democrats had a 1-person majority in the Senate.
Okay. So tell a little bit about that point in time. What was occurring in South Dakota socially and politically that made that happen, and then how did the winds of change occur that has prevented it ever since?
Well, I think Dick Kneip was a big factor. He was a very popular guy. I remember when he was campaigning in the summer of 1970, he came out here. We used to have a parade day. It was associated with the band concert. They'd have a big parade in town. And Dick and I had met, because I'd done some lobbying in '69 down, so I knew Dick Kneip. So he said he wanted to be in the parade. So I went to the guy who was head of the parade, and I said, I'd like to get a spot in the parade for Dick Kneip was running for governor. Well, we don't let candidates in the parade. I said, well, I see Frank Ferraro on there. There are some state senators and House members on. Well, they're elected officials. I said, so is Dick Kneip. He's a senator from East River. So I think he's entitled to a spot. So they said, okay. So I hustled around and got myself a convertible from a friend, and I drove him down the parade route. Half time he was out walking instead of in the car. He'd jump out and walk, shake hands. He was just a marvelous politician, a marvelous campaigner. And I think that stirred up the Democrats a lot and gave them more faith in getting people elected that fall. And that summer I'd been chosen as one of the outstanding freshman legislators. I went to a conference down in Florida that was put on by Rutgers University and there's an institute. Tom Green from Watertown and I were the two from South Dakota. And they talked about the need for open government, transparency. So I came back thinking that's a great idea. We need more openness. So that's when I decided to run for speaker. And so I ran for speaker, and it turned out to be a tie. Well, I'll give you the history of the tie vote. South Dakota used to have 75 members in the House. But when they did redistricting after 72, they cut it down to 70. And with 70, of course, you could have a tie. And as the bill was going through the House, somebody said that we could have a tie. So Republicans controlled, and they said, well, let's provide in the Constitution then that in the event of a tie, whichever party had the governorship would get to organize the House. So lo and behold, we had a tie. So I ran for speaker, nobody opposed me, so at our caucus I got elected.
And I want to make sure I have the years right on this. So this would have been your second term?
Beginning of the second term.
Beginning of the second term, and Kneip had been elected governor at that point.
But that's correct, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yep.
So take us back to the time when Dick Kneip was running for governor against Frank Farrar, a sitting governor,
Right.
who had some controversial issues in banking and other legislative issues. But tell us about the campaign issues and Dick.
Well, as I remember that race between when he ran against Farrar, and I can't remember if it was the first time he ran or the second time. Frank Henderson had ran against Farrar in the primary and beat him up pretty bad. It was all, Frank was a tough campaigner too. And he almost beat Farrar, ran a good race. And that kind of weakened Frank to start with. And then, like I say, Dick was just a very good campaigner. In fact, many years later, I was having dinner with Frank Farrar one time. We were talking about Dick Kneip. He says, I'd go into a restaurant and shake hands, turn around, there was Dick Kneip right behind me, just shaking the same hands. But Dick was a marvelous campaigner, a very quick study. I remember when he was governor, I was the speaker. I'd go down talking about some issue. He'd pick up on it just like that. A very quick study, very bright man.
Yeah. Why was he as effective as governor, as you just talked about him being a good governor? Why?
I think a lot of it, as Democrats at that time, the Democrats hadn't been in control for so long, we didn't think there was anything that was not possible. Dick, he reorganized the executive branch. We passed an amendment on the Article 3 of the Constitution, the Judiciary Article. We passed an EPA Act. We passed the South Dakota Investment Council. A lot of things that are still around.
As I recall, South Dakota was the first state in the nation to pass a civil rights law for disabled people in the Kneip.
That could be. I don't remember that. I do remember, though, that we passed the Equal Rights Amendment when I was Speaker in 1974. And I remember when we passed it, the gallery was full of farmers and their farm wives. We got booed when we passed it. But we had to have Republican support, and we got some Republican support, and we passed it. About 5 or 6 years later, when Bill Jenkins was governor, the Republicans were back in control. They rescinded our action. They rescinded the approval of the civil rights, of the Equal Rights Amendment.
What changed in that point in that 6-year period of time in South Dakota from your perspective?
Well, I think one of the things that caused the Democrats to lose control in the 1974 election, one of the things that Governor Kneip had wanted us to introduce was an income tax bill, which we did. And we tied on to it some type of a relief on your property taxes as well. So it was kind of a combination, property tax relief, but an income tax bill. And that was not popular. We got it past the House, we could not get it past the Senate. It turned out in this 74 election, a lot of the Democrats that had supported the income tax bill got beat. I wasn't running again, so it didn't affect me, but a lot of my Democratic friends that ran got beat. I think that was a turning point, and from there it's kind of gone down. As you know, this last year we had 3 Democrats in the Senate, and I think it was 8 in the House.
But you know, you alluded to something then versus now, and I wonder if you talk about what impact you think that has. You ran in a general district, and now we have much more specific
Right.
districting, and of course everyone has gerrymandering. And
Well, when I ran for re-election, by that time they had changed some of the districts. You still ran 5 against 5, but the district was different. It was no longer just Benton County. It did not include the western part of the state or the county. It did not include the Wall district. It was more centralized just in Rapid City. In fact, I remember Frank Henderson, who was running for re-election in the Senate, and he called me that rascal from North Dakota that tore the corner off the flag of Benton County. I think that may have something to do with it. We again elected 3 of the 5 were from the Democratic Party, that from Benton County. There was some changes, but there were still 3 out of 5. I think I probably focus more on the transparency. You know, my first 2 years in Pierre, this for an example, Marci, if I had a bill in a committee, I was not on the committee, I had a bill before, I could go and present my bill. But when they wanted to talk about it and vote on it, everybody got kicked out of the committee. Observers, people who wanted to testify, even another representative that was a sponsor could not be in the committee room when they voted on it. And the vote was never published. The debate was never published. There were no calendars. You didn't know when your bill was going to come up until they told you so. If they didn't want to bring it up, they wouldn't. The committee chair could pocket veto bills. And that program I went to down in Florida talked about the need to change all that. So the first thing we did when we got down to Pierre, when I was speaker, we wrote the rules of civil procedure for the House and for the Senate and the joint rules. We provided there must be a vote taken in every committee. The committees must be open to the public, to everybody. There must be an advance notice. It must be published. You know, all that was opened up. And it's still pretty much what they do today, although they backed up somewhat.
yeah, I was just going to ask if that's the same. What have they backed up? Or,
Well, now they can introduce a bill with just a title. We could not have done that back then. When you introduce a bill with just a title, then some guy got something he wants to put in there. He puts it on that bill, gets it debated without notice, without any hearing, and then it passes, and then they change the title. That's one of the things I know they've done.
it doesn't necessarily serve the citizenry, does it?
I don't
For
think it
them to-
does.
Yeah, yeah.
If I were to run again, those are the things I talk about, but I'm not going to run again.
Let's go back to Dick Kneip a bit. When you look back, particularly over the arc of history, what would you say are some of the most important things that South Dakotans should remember about the Dick Kneip administration?
I think the reorganization of the executive branch, he reduced the number of boards and commissions and all that. I think the Environmental Protection Act, I remember between the second and third year, we had a study committee, and we went and looked at lakes across the state, how the pollution was affecting them, how they needed some cleanup, things like that. That's a lasting effect in South Dakota, I think. The Investment Council, the South Dakota Investment Council, one of the best in the country now. Without Dick Kneip and Harvey was in the Senate at that time, and he pushed that very hard. So I think things like that.
What was happening before there was an investment council? What was happening to state retirement system monies?
I think that various boards and commissions and departments invested their own money. I'm not sure how that worked, but that's centralized it and kind of set it outside the political screen. You know, I see now Governor Kneip wants to stopped the investment council from investing anything that has anything to China to do with it. Well, she doesn't have any control over that. That's done by the investment council. So that's been a very good thing for South Dakota.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, it's one of the highest performing annually
That's right.
in terms of performance and stability.
Yep. Steve Myers, who was inducted in the South Dakota Hall of Fame the same year as I was, he was our first director of that and did a marvelous job. Mm-hmm. Super job.
For people who hadn't followed it as closely as you, could you give us an idea of prior to the reformation of the cabinetry that Kneip did? What was it before and what was it after? And kind of what was the general view about why there needed to be a reorganization?
Well, I'm not real clear on how it was before, although I remember just as a lawyer, if you contacted a state agency, you didn't know for sure who to talk. They passed the buck from one or the other. There wasn't as much cooperation among the various state boards and agencies as I think there was after that. I think that's probably been a big effect.
Mm-hmm. So Dick Kneip ran and was reelected.
He was reelected with two-year terms, and then when he changed it to 4-year term, then he ran elected as a 4-year term. And before he finished that term, he resigned to be ambassador to Singapore, and that's when Harvey Woolman became governor for a short period of time.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have any conversations with him as to why he took the ambassadorship and didn't fill out his term?
I guess I never talked to him personally. I know I heard, he just thought it was a great opportunity, and I think that was that President Carter, I think, that sent him over there? I'm not sure. I think so. We didn't visit with them in Singapore. I know Duhamel's went over there and visited him in Singapore.
Interesting. One of the earlier interviews I did today, one of the interviewees commented that she remembers almost, and we're talking about in the current arc of history, but she remembers almost no pressure that Kneip put on Democratic lawmakers, that there may have only been 2 times that he actually came to the floor in support of something. Do you have some stories about Kneip, or what is your memory of him, particularly as leader, in the process?
Well, I know I met with him a lot, both business-wise and socially. Socially, I remember some night, Larry Pearsall was the Democratic leader when I was Speaker, and Larry and I were and still are, very, very good friends. So sometimes we'd work late up in the Capitol building. We had adjoining rooms at the old Holiday Inn. And as we leave the Capitol, 8, 9 o'clock at night, we'd stop at Dick's office. He's still down there. So we'd visit him, and we said, we're going to head over back to the room. You want to come over? He said, I'll be over. So Dick come over, pour himself a drink, and then he'd get on the telephone. He'd call people and say, Mary, I see that John died. I just want you to know how sorry I feel about that. So we had a very close social relationship in addition to the business relationship. But I think I'd go down to his office on various things almost every day when I was Speaker. So we visited a lot. In terms of him putting pressure on the Democrats, I think maybe only once or twice he came to a Democratic caucus, at least the House caucus. He leaned on us pretty hard on the income tax bill, I remember that. And Larry and I leaned pretty hard on our Democrats to get them supported too.
Why was that so important to him at that time in South Dakota history?
Well, there was a lot of griping about the tax structure. Real estate tax was pretty high, the people felt. So by giving this income tax thing, he could give some relief to some of the real estate tax property payers. I think that was one of the reasons. And people were ready for a change, we thought, because they had changed from a lot of Republicans to some Democrats. So we felt the timing was probably good. But the especially East River, Sioux Falls came out very strongly against the income tax, and that hurt us.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of considered political poison since, right?
Oh, yes. In fact, there's been talk a lot of times about putting in the Constitution that we shall not have an income tax. That hasn't happened, but I know there's been talk about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there were some rural Democrats that were pretty much against it too, I think. In fact, there were some Democrats and some Republicans from the rural areas that would caucus. We call it the Farmyard Caucus.
Mm-hmm. Taxation became, I think, one of your specialties, if I remember correctly.
Well, later on the issue of the sales tax, use tax, yeah.
Yeah. Tell me about was there an inheritance tax in the state at the time?
Yes, at that time there was both an inheritance tax and an estate tax. And since then they've repealed the estate tax, as I remember correctly now. The estate tax is a tax on the estate. The inheritance tax is on what you inherit. It's part of the estate.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And in an agricultural economy, I would have to think those would be particularly burdensome.
Probably so.
Yeah.
You know, if you inherit a lot of land or something,
Yeah,
I think that's true. Yes.
So reformation of state government, income tax was one of his important things. What other things, as you look back at the Kneip era, do you think should be particularly?
Well, he's the one that got the med school passed.
Say more about that.
Absolutely. You know, Ted Munster was his executive secretary, basically. And Ted was with the University of South Dakota at that time. So Ted worked very hard, as well as the governor, of course, getting that passed, and they did. And it was a battle, absolutely.
So, and I'm going to ask a question out of ignorance. Was there no medical school training in South Dakota at the time?
That's correct.
So everybody had to leave.
Yeah, they had the contracts with, I believe, Nebraska, maybe Minnesota, perhaps someplace else you could send them down. Also for, I think, dentistry as well at that time, and I'm not sure what it is now.
What were the issues around that politically? What was the controversy?
I think, you know, a lot of people wanted to go to med school in their home state rather than go out of state. And there was a need for doctors in small towns, as there still is. And it was harder to get them to come back to South Dakota unless there was some program to help them. Well, you couldn't ask Minnesota to establish a program to help the small town in South Dakota. But if you had your own med school, you could do that. And they had done it.
Were there discussions or debates around which college it would be attached to, any of the funding? I mean, what were some of the heavy lifting issues?
Well, the big push came from the university. Of course, with Ted there, that really focused on, I don't remember any controversy about, let's put it someplace else. No. There may have been some discussion about putting it in Sioux Falls. And as you know, it's kind of split now, as I think it is anyway.
I think people would find it amazing to look back and think of a time that there was not medical training in the state of South Dakota.
That's true. You know, I think South Dakota would help them financially if they had to go out of state, but I'm not sure I remember that correctly, but it could be.
And does the state still, and I'm again asking out of ignorance, does the state still fund predominantly the medical school? I mean, a lot of the other higher institution learning models have flipped, right? It used to be 80% state funding, 20% private.
Right.
Now it's.
I think they do, and like you say, it's so true. You know, my wife was on the Board of Regents for 18 years, and when she started on the Board of Regents, the state paid 70% of the cost, the student paid 30%. Now it's almost the opposite. The student pays about 70%, and the state only pays 30%.
So you mentioned that you, obviously, as leader, would see the governor quite a bit.
Yes.
And I'm sure talking about legislative agendas and other things. Can you remember times either he gave you some particularly good advice, or the other way, you gave him, particularly on an issue, stand down on that issue or push that issue? Take us behind the office doors.
Well, we would visit about it, but I don't think there was ever any strong pressure. I remember he wanted his income tax bad. Even Larry and I were some reluctant at first, but we said, okay, we're going to put it through. We tried our darndest, and we got it through the House.
Yeah.
It was great having Larry Pearsall as the Democratic leader. And the other thing I might mention, Marci, is that the Republican leader in the House was Joe Barnett from Aberdeen, who had been in line to be Speaker. And of course, it didn't get to that time. But as an example, at the end of every session, we'd have the calendar for the next day's session. Many times, Joe and Larry and I would sit down in my office or one of their offices and go through the next day's calendar. Okay, can we agree on this? How about if we do this, that? Then can you agree? We work things out. We compromise. If we didn't work it out, we'd say, okay, we'll fight over that one. But it was a very congenial relationship. And then after, we'd go have a drink together. It wasn't the partisan battle it is today, even though we were tied. You know, most bills, it wasn't a Democrat versus Republican bill. They'd come on our side, we'd go on their side, we'd get things done. We compromised.
And how do you contrast that to what you see happening in the legislature today?
To me, there's no comparison. I would not want to be down there today. From what I understand, they don't even talk to each other. It's just...
Even as predominantly Republican legislators.
That's what I understand, yeah. It was civil back then. everybody got along. We had parties together, played basketball together.
What do you think has changed? I mean, you sit back and look at these things and talk to a lot of people. What do you think has changed in South
Well, let me
Dakota?
relate. Some years after Tom Daschle was no longer the majority leader in Washington, my wife and I were there and we had lunch one day with Tom and his wife. And I asked Tom that question. Tom, what's changed about this? He said, Gene, the social media. Everybody reads all this stuff on social media and they think they have all the answers. He said, that's really, he thinks, the stem of it. And I agree with that. I think the social media has really harmed the civility of our political process in this country.
Does that ever change? Do you see that ever changing? Does something ever change that?
Boy, I hope so, but I'm not sure how it's going to happen.
Yeah. The issues that you were involved with, which of course overlapped with the Kneip administration, what were you particularly proudest of being involved with?
Changing the rules of procedure. To me, that's the most lasting effect. I think the most important effect of the legislative process. Even if they change back on some things. Now you know when the bill's going to come up. You get to sit in the committee when they vote and discuss it. It's all of record now. I just think it's a marvelous change.
It certainly helped openness in government, and now we have technology tools that make it easier to find out some of those things. You don't have to be there and look on paper.
You know, and the technology changes, it's been amazing. When I was down there, we didn't have email, we didn't have internet. You had your bill book. There was nothing electronic at all. It's amazing how it's changed.
What do you say to people when, you know, there's kind of a general distrust in institutions now, whether it's media, politics, the law, government in general. There's kind of a skepticism, cynicism, or just general distrust in institutions. What do you say to people when they poo-poo being in the legislature or on a school board?
That's a tough one. I wish I knew the answer. The lack of civility, again, I think the social media has something to do with that. People don't care about other people. If you disagree with them, you know, they don't like you just because you don't agree with them. They can't disagree agreeably. And you should be able to disagree agreeably. But they don't do that anymore. And it's set up this almost a hatred among people, which is really sad.
What did what was it like when, I wonder if you could recall a time when there was a particularly serious disagreement in the legislature, and if you could describe, since this is for the Historical Society, about some of those conversations and how it might have been different at that point in time.
Well, I remember some of the urban versus rural battles probably being the toughest in terms of hard feelings. We had some great rural legislators, Democrats, but boy, they didn't care much for Rapid City. I remember after the Rapid City flood, we had to get a bill through to finance the Civic Center. And I was trying to get that bill through the House. I'd always come about 6 or 7 votes short. And one day, Representative Menno Cheddar from Huron came up to me and said, Gene, I see you're running short on votes. I said, I'm having a heck of a time. He said, well, we want some money to put a roof on the hog barn at the state fairgrounds in Huron for the state fair. And some of you guys aren't voting for it. So we made a deal. We voted for his hog barn roof, and they voted for the Civic Center and got it through. But that's the kind of compromise that you need. But some of those rural-urban battles are pretty hard, pretty tough.
When you describe compromise in this day and age, people see compromise as a dirty word.
I know. But I was giving quite a few speeches on that sales tax issue around the country. And I always say, compromise is not a dirty word. When I took political science at St. John's, how do you define democracy? The art of compromise. That's democracy.
The founders were wise, weren't they, in the
They sure were.
They set up our country.
If you go back and read the Federalist Papers, for example, that's what you're going to find. Absolutely.
What are a couple of the important stories, whether they're connected to Governor Kneip or not, about your time in the legislature that you think ought to be remembered for history?
Well, as I said, the changing of the rules, the compromises we worked out, the civility between the two parties, the lack of animosity. It was then a good time. We didn't get paid very little. Well, my first years, I know you got 5 cents a mile for one round trip to pier during the whole year. I think your salary for the double session was, I don't know, maybe $1,500, something like that. No per diem at all.
And usually dawn to sometimes late in the early morning hours.
Oh,
before the
yes.
committee hearings, right? Not the glamour it's
That's right.
cracked up to be. I just had a question, I lost it. Give me just a second. Oh, I wanted to go back to you. We're talking about being in the House when South Dakota ratified the Equal Rights Amendment in
Right.
1973, and then 6 years later rescinded that. What happened from your perspective to change the view of lawmakers in the state of South Dakota?
That's a good question. I think, as I said, I think the mid-'70s were kind of a swing to the more liberal side generally across the country. We had Democratic presidents, and we got the Republicans to vote for it when we passed it in '74. Well, those Republicans probably weren't down there 6 years later. The whole state became more conservative. As I mentioned, the farm wives were against it then. They're afraid they're going to have to use the men's bathroom, for example. The whole attitude of the country was changing, becoming more conservative. And South Dakota knew that if they rescinded it, there'd be less chance they'd be passed at the federal level. And Jankel didn't fight for it at all, as I remember.
Mm-hmm. So you were out of office by the time Bill Jankel was elected, right?
I did not run again in the '74 election.
Okay.
'74 election.
Yeah, and what made that decision for you? Why did you decide not to run again?
Well, we had 2 young kids at home, had a law practice that I get back to. And at that time, I figured, well, hey, once you've been speaker, there's no place else to go.
Yeah.
Although I know since then, has been reelected for another 2-year term, but back then it never happened before, I don't think.
Yeah, as you look back now, are you glad you did it?
Oh, absolutely. Excuse me. It opened up so many things. Not too many years after that, in Maple I ran into Judge Don Porter. He said, Kneip stopped me in the street. He wanted me to be on the Uniform Laws Commission. And I said, Governor, I don't think judges should be on that. Why don't you appoint some past speakers? So Kneip appointed myself and Don Oshheim, who was a speaker before me, Republican from Watertown. So I went on the Uniform Laws Commission in 1975. And this year, the meeting is going to be in Hawaii. It'll be my 46th annual meeting I've attended.
Explain to the layman what the Uniform Law Commission is and what it does.
There are commissioners appointed from all 50 states, Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Anywhere from 3 to maybe 10 in some states. They're all lawyers, and they meet once a year to write laws that they think should be uniform or close to uniform throughout all those jurisdictions. We have no enactment authority we can recommend. So we've written everything from the Uniform Commercial Code, Uniform Probate Code, Uniform Domestic Acts, a lot of uniform acts. I'm working on a Uniform Election Law Act right now, which we hope to pass someday. And it's a long, slow process. But we meet in committees. I had the privilege of serving as president of that organization from 1997 to 1999. It's a great organization, great people, distinguished lawyers, judges now, law school professors. It's just a wonderful organization, and every state belongs to it.
And so once those uniform actions, whatever they are written, they're taken back for legislative action?
Then, we try to get them acted in all 50 states. We've been successful in many of our acts. Some acts are not successful.
Mm-hmm. Do they have to be passed in all 50 states to be considered? So
No.
it's just a recommendation,
Right.
state by
Yep.
state.
Yep. South Dakota's enacted about 168, I think, altogether, something like that.
Yeah. Are there any notable exceptions in South Dakota?
That we have not enacted.
Correct. That the majority of other states have.
There's Uniform Trust Act. South Dakota's trust law is somewhat unique. And so they have not enacted the Uniform Act. South Dakota doesn't recognize the law against perpetuities, which opens it up to a broader spectrum.
And as written about recently in the Wall Street Journal and
That's
New York
right.
Times, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. When you were talking about that, one other thing pinged into my brain. Wasn't it during the Kneip administration that there was basically a reformation of the court system?
Yes, we wrote Article 3, which is the Judiciary Act of the Constitution. We unified the court system, put a mandatory retirement age in, kind of changed the jurisdiction somewhat.
What does it mean when you say unified the court system?
Now the Supreme Court really sets the rules for all the courts. Before that wasn't necessarily true. We eliminated the county courts back then. So now it's a much more unified system.
So those county courts that went away, we now flow through a circuit. We've got magistrate that
Right.
flows through a circuit,
Yep.
which then flows up to the.
Right.
Okay.
You know, South Dakota, it's one of those states that does not have an intermediate court of appeals. You go from the trial court, which is the circuit court, directly to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Yep.
Is there a story that you can tell about Dick Kneip that should get recorded for history? Probably the better question is there one you shouldn't tell but you would tell?
Well, I'll tell one that I can tell. Dick loves to play poker. And I figure one night of the week, he had his poker club. Democrats, Republicans, primarily state senators, not too many House members. And he always played that night. And Nancy was home alone with the kids. And she didn't let him know. So she called Larry Pearsall and I. Larry and I roomed right next to each other. Can you guys come over and babysit me? So Larry and I would go over and watch TV with Nancy until Dick come home. That was always kind of fun. We used to laugh about that. But Dick was just I know one time I was heading out to the airport to fly back to Pier, and I was going out. I got passed by this South Dakota patrol car. When I noticed the passenger seat was Kneip. The driver was Danny Eastnick, who was the head of the Highway Patrol at that time. And I thought, Kneip is going to fly back to Pier in his private plane. I'm going to catch a ride. So I took off and chased after him, got out there. I got there, and Eastnick says, you're kind of going pretty fast, aren't you? I said, you bet, I want a free ride to Pier. He said, you got it. And Dick just laughed and away we went.
Perfect. Were there any, in your view, miscues during the Kneip administration that, looking back, it was, gee, I wish we'd done that differently?
No, I really can't think of anything. I'm sure at the time, I remember when I first became Speaker, I was going to have all this paperwork, keep track of all the committees, where every bill was. Well, it would overwhelm me. But I had the good fortune. Matt Sutton was my chief clerk, and he did a marvelous job, just wonderful. The other story I'll tell, like I said, Larry and I roomed in adjoining rooms at the Holiday Inn. So we're setting up shop, and the previous house clerk was Paul Inman. So I was talking to Paul one day and telling him that's where we're at. I said, we sure wish we had a cooler. He said, I have an old refrigerator. So Paul brought his refrigerator over, so we kept his refrigerator in our room so we could keep cold beer and stuff in there. He was a super guy. Yeah. In fact, one day when Matt couldn't make it, I called up Paul. I said, Paul, can you come over and be the chief clerk? He said, sure. The other thing on that reminds me, sometime before I was Speaker, Jim Gilbert from Spearfish had been Speaker. Not immediately before me, but sometime before that. Well, someday I had to leave for something, so I sent a message. I said, tell Jim to come up here and be Speaker for a while. So Jim and Velma come up and was Speaker for me for a while. Everybody got a kick out of that.
So that, I was just thinking about your time as Speaker. First of all, you were one of the youngest in the country, and the second was you'd only been in the legislature 2 years, and there had been people who'd been around a lot longer. Why do you think? Why were you interested in that? Why do you think your cohorts elected you?
Well, that session I had down in Florida really opened my eyes to it. I remember after we learned out we had a tie, one of my partners at that time was Louis Freiberg, who had been in the legislature way back when. And Louis said, you guys got a tie. I said, yeah. He said, Gene, he said, why don't you run for Speaker? I said, really? He said, why not? So I said, I'll try. So I wrote a letter to all the Democrats who had been elected and said, I'm interested in this, and I told you why. So we caucused, and I think it was in Huron. And we all got together, and somebody said, okay, who wants to be Speaker? And I think it was probably Bert Ellingson, who had been the Democratic leader before. He nominated me. I was second. Nobody else ran, so I got elected.
And you added a lot more work to your life.
Oh, yes, but it was enjoyable.
Yeah. great.
Everybody was so kind to me. That was so nice. Speaking about the youngest one, we went to, at that time there was a legislative leaders conference. And I don't remember where it was. It could have been in Seattle or someplace. We went, and my wife came with me. And she said she was riding up the elevator with this gentleman. And he said, "Oh, you're here for the conference?" She says, "Yes." She says, "Is your husband on somebody's staff?" "No, he's the speaker." The speaker? Where from? She says, "South Dakota." "How old is he?" I think I was like 31, maybe something like that. She told me, she said, "Lady, in my state, they don't let you even get on the floor until you're at least 40.
Maybe you didn't have a perspective of how big of a deal it was.
That's correct, I didn't.
Yeah. Let me pause for just a second. I'm going to let you get a drink of water.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to look up a couple notes I wanted to
Yep.
pull here real quickly, make sure I don't forget to ask something. Hang on. As my little granddaughter says when something is loading, she says yoding, yoding, yoding. Okay. I want to ask you about kind of the overlay of some of the issues going on in South Dakota at the time Kneip was governor and you were in the legislature. One of the most notable, of course, was the Wounded Knee occupation.
Yes.
Do you have any perspective of what was going on in the governor's office then, and what were the conversations in the legislature?
You know, there wasn't that much, although I remember one day, maybe it was after the occupation was over, I can't remember for sure. One of the aides at somebody's mama told me that either Russell Means or Pelletier, probably Means, was speaking to the state senate. And that's when Bill Doherty would have been lieutenant governor, I think. And I talked to Barnett and Pearsall, and they said, "We don't want him over here." So I called Barnett and Pearsall up there, and I said, "Okay, what do we do if he comes over and wants to speak here?" And we agreed that if we did, I'd just call a recess and we'd all walk out. Well, fortunately, he never did come over. So it didn't really become an issue, that frontal in the House side. We were all concerned, of course, kept advised, but there really wasn't much we could do about it as legislators. And I don't remember having any particular conversation with the governor about it, no.
Mm-hmm. Were there conversations at that time? I mean, you had the AIM movement, which was certainly perceived to be a more radical element, but there were also other Native organizations that were concerned about tribal representation and Native voices in the state of South Dakota. Were there issues being worked on at that point in time?
You know, as I remember, there was one bill that we passed setting up some type of a commission, and I got to appoint, as Speaker, I got to appoint 1 or 2 members to it. And I remember, I think I appointed Sheldon Songstead, who was a Republican from Sioux Falls. And I appointed him because he had shown a real interest in it. Mm-hmm. And then after I appointed him, I caught hell from some Native Americans about it. And I'm not sure how effective or what that commission did, but I remember that particular bill that went through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the other things that the Kneip administration is credited with is broadening the state sales tax. So income tax, you were engaged in any of that?
You know, I remember when it was broadened. I don't remember the year. But I remember, I didn't recall it was in the Kneip administration, but it could have been. I remember after it was broadened, it included sales tax on attorney's fees. And of course, the lawyers weren't happy about that. And Frank Henderson was in the Senate at that time. And later on at a Pennington County bar meeting, somebody asked Senator Henderson, "How come you guys brought the lawyers under but not the doctors?" And Senator Henderson's answer was, "The doctors had a better lobbyist than you guys had."
Well, yeah, we in South Dakota pay sales tax on virtually everything.
Very broad.
Yeah.
Very, not the highest in the nation, but very broad.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay, I wanted to make sure I went back to a couple of those things, and those were points in time that the people I don't think really remember. I was looking
Well, it's
back.
50 years ago, Marci.
I know it, and of course we all in our brains think we're 25 years old, but You were out of the legislature by 79.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, out of the legislature by 79. Okay, all right. Anything that I have not asked you that you think should be recorded for state history about your time with Dick Kneip and your time in the legislature?
I think, if nothing else, we proved that two-party system is better. I don't care if it's all Republicans or all Democrats. A two-party system works better. You need those checks and balances. And I think we showed that in the years that there was a little bit of a two-party system. You know, they talk about the days the Democrats controlled the state. Well, if a tie in one house and a one-person majority in the other house and the governor is controlling the state, it's like saying that the Democrats control Washington when they have a Democratic president and they had a tie in the Senate and a little bit of a majority in the House. That's not controlling it.
Yeah. Will we ever get back to closer parity?
I never say never, but we got a long ways to go. Tom Daschle just did an interview not very long ago that I read, and they asked him the same question, and he said, boy, it looks awful tough for South Dakota. I mean, look at the last election. I thought that Jamie Smith was a great candidate. He didn't do as well as Billy had done when he ran against Christie the first time.
Mm-hmm. What's your view of the current governor?
Not good. I'll leave it at that. Not good.
Okay. All right. Anything else I should have asked you and I didn't?
I think you pretty much covered the waterfront, I think. I really want to stress how much I enjoyed my time down there. I made great friends. I hate to see some of them passing away now, but it opened up so many doors for us. I'm sure that's what helped Pat get on the Board of Regents, got her on the Science Authority Board. We've been friends with so many people that we would never met otherwise, both in-state and out of state. So it's been just a marvelous thing for my life, I know that.
Well, for people like me who benefited from your public service and Pat's public service, thank you, and thank you for coming down today.
Thank you, Marci. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.